You're someone with a vision for your practice, for your side hustle, and for your personal journey. But when it comes to establishing your path on how to get to where you want to be with your practice, things get a little messy. You're also someone who'd prefer to go in person instead of to groups and listening to everyone else's story. To me, it sounds like you could benefit from one-on-one consulting with our experienced practice of the practice consultants. From $5.95 a month and up, you can work with a consultant that will give you more direction and practical tried and tested tips matched to you and your goals. For more information, visit practiceofthepractice.com/apply. Again, that's practiceofthepractice.com/apply. This is the Practice of the Practice podcast with Joe Sanok, session number 1181. I'm Joe Sanok, your host, and welcome to the Practice of the Practice podcast. I am so excited to have you here today, where we help you build a thriving private practice that you absolutely love. And this month, we've been covering a lot of things that are more on the clinical side. We kicked off this series, the Better Mental Wellness series, discussing psychedelic-assisted therapy. We talked about self-compassion, deeper mindfulness, chronic illness. We talked about being a psychotherapist with autism. We talked about highly sensitive people and overcoming self-betrayal. So all sorts of really interesting topics this month. So glad that you're joining us. Last month, we talked marketing. We did Marketing Month, did I think 15 or so episodes all around marketing your private practice. You want to check that out. And from the beginning of the year, we have our Even Better Year series, all sorts of things that are small steps in the right direction that will help your practice continue to thrive and for you to just absolutely love your practice. Today on the show, we have Alex Katehakis, who is a Ph.D. and is the founder of Center for Healthy Sex in Los Angeles and author of several books, including What Turns You On, Sex Addiction as Affect Dysregulation, and Mirror of Intimacy. Welcome to the show today, Alex.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, I've been talking sex since about second grade because my mom was a sex educator in the schools. And so very early on when I had questions, my mom was very ahead of her time and just answered them, oftentimes more in depth than what I was asking. So she was just so excited to use those skills to help raise, the kids. So welcome to the show today.
Well, thank you for having me. And I think I would call you lucky. Maybe it was a little TMI, but at least, she was attempting to be transparent and raise sexually healthy kids.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's like I had that on one side, and then my parents decided to also put me into Catholic school. So there was a mixed message of purity culture and discussing sex in the home that was like kind of more medical. So it's interesting to just think through, as I raise my two daughters, like what kind of like environment am I creating for them? But why don't we just start with how did you get into this field?
Well, how far back do we want to go? But I think ultimately the short version is I was in my late 20s when my parents, after 35 years, divorced. And I was dating and single and trying to answer the question of what makes for a healthy, happy, long-term erotic connection with somebody over time. And I didn't have a role model for that, and I didn't see it around me. And that became my question, or my quest, if you will. I got very interested in human sexuality because I also really loved sex. I was lucky as a 27-year-old woman. I didn't have a lot of body shame or insecurity. I was enjoying my body and my youth. And I wanted to really figure out what it meant to connect with somebody intimately, closely, and sustain it over time. And so my my only class in human sexuality in graduate school just lit me up because of the book we were reading, which was David Snarch's book, Constructing the Sexual Crucible, which I still think is a seminal piece of work on putting together psychotherapy with sex. He wasn't just talking about tips and techniques and positions and sensate focus. he was really looking at sex as a developmental task. And, one of the stages of actually becoming an adult and becoming mature. And that was just endlessly exciting and fascinating to me. And the rest is history, as they say.
Mm. Well, having been in this work for so long and leading the Center for Healthy Sex in LA, I'm sure you've noticed kind of different trends, different just kind of things that are maybe popping more into culture. I would love to hear, we're a couple years post the 2020 pandemic. How have you seen sex change, whether it's in conversation, whether it's in what people are coming in for help around? Like, what's changed from your clinical point of view?
Well, I really think the internet changed the way that we have sex and changed our culture radically in many ways. And sex was one of those ways because with the advent of internet pornography, sex became available to everybody 24/7 in a way it never had been before. I mean, if you just remember, you know, in the 90s, if you wanted pornography, you had to get in your car and drive to a video store and go into the back room with the curtain and rent your video and all of that. And then with the internet, it was just, again, completely accessible. And what that did was it twofold. One, it educated people about sex and sexuality and had people feeling like they weren't alone in what their preferences or predilections were. And it also tipped the scales in really problematic ways where we saw increased amounts of material that were highly misogynistic, and people also becoming more addicted, if you will, to pornography. And now I think we have the gamut. We've got plenty of ethical porn being made, and also material that we would consider more misogynistic and everything in between.
Mm.
So it opened the door for solo sexuality. In fact, you can't find a battery. Well, that's not true. You can't find battery operated vibrators, but most of them have USB ports. So they plug right into your computer for recharge and use at the ready. So um, we are no longer reliant upon connection and partnership for sex and sexuality the way we weren't once were. And look, people have
Mm.
been masturbating from the beginning of time. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that it's so much easier for people to have a solo sex life now than ever before.
Yeah. Now, I feel like in my upbringing, and especially like being raised Catholic and went through a period of time in the evangelical world, um, a lot of the discussion around internet porn and porn addiction was always from a religious point of view. Like, it's not good because of whatever belief system. Um, can you talk about for internet porn, and we don't have to spend the whole episode on this, but like what's healthy and what's unhealthy, and like and how do you think through that topic?
Well, that's we really have to pull that apart because, for starters, I think of pornography as a First Amendment right. It's a speech issue. So we can get moralistic and all of that around it. I am not particularly interested in those conversations. I'm interested in actions and consequences and
Mm,
the messes people have in life from something, which in the parlance of 12 step would be unmanageability. So if somebody's using pornography and it's enhancing to their sex life, their sense of well-being, it's not lingering, they don't feel gross or dirty afterwards, then it's probably fine. But if they are hiding it, lying about it, using it to a point where they're late for work or masturbating to the point of injury or so preoccupied with it that they are neglecting other more vital parts of their lives, then it's typically a problem. So it's hard to prescribe that X number of times per week is the right amount. And that's also depends on, are we talking about an 18-year-old male or a 60-year-old male or a, 25-year-old female or a 40-year-old female? Because everybody's libido is different at different times of their life. And our sex and sexuality changes over time. That's another topic, but I think one of the things people should be on the lookout for is that historically, and again, probably pre-1990, when all these medications came out for male erectile dysfunction, which are called PDE5 inhibitors, also known as Cialis and Viagra, they were developed for old men, men in their 50s, 60s that were having trouble getting erections, which is generally a problem of oxygen, right, to the body, to
Mm.
the penile chambers. And there was a tipping point where all of a sudden we started seeing young men coming into treatment around 2000, I would guess, mid 2000s, 28, 30, 35-year-old men who couldn't get erections and were using these drugs. And the problem was not that they were old. The problem was that they had neuronal fatigue from excessive pornography usage, and specifically internet pornography usage. And so they were taking a medication that was not designed for their problem. So in other words, it wasn't a penile problem, it was a brain problem. And that's
Mm.
when somebody comes into your practice and they're a young male, healthy, and they say they can't get an erection, that's really a red flag to ask, how much internet pornography are you watching and how often? And how long are
Mm.
you spending when you're watching it? So you really have to assess what's going on there.
Yeah, and from a clinical perspective, if people are asking that, are there, and obviously we want people, if they're going to be doing like deeper work in this area, to get extra training. But what are some things that would be red flags in regards to how a client would answer that?
Generally, people are pretty honest about it. They come in, they can't get an erection with their boyfriend, girlfriend. And if you start just looking at the sex therapy aspect of it, you're going to miss the boat. If you ask the questions about porn, also, what age did they start looking at the pornography? Because the younger the viewing, the more likely they have these neuronal networks that are tenaciously wired together. And the average age, as I understand it, of pornography viewing in the US today is 8 years old. So it's incredibly young to be seeing these intensely, digified images because they are so arousing. So it makes it harder for people over time to get aroused by a flesh and blood person because it's just not as stimulating or exciting.
Mm.
So when you start to pull that apart with somebody and ask them about when they first started watching it, how long, what kind of material, if the material has become more intense over time, they start to come to the conclusion, meaning they, the patient or the client themselves, that maybe this is too much and maybe this is what your brain on porn looks like now.
Mm. Now, if we shift away from specifically pornography and look at what is healthy sexuality, if we just start super umbrella, how would you define that? And then we can drill in wherever you think it would be best to drill in after that.
Well, I try not to answer that question because
Awesome.
I don't know what it is for you. I know what it is for me today. I don't know what it will be for me or you tomorrow. So it's a question that I pose to my clients first and foremost. But generally, if I really broaden it out, as long as it's consensual and it's not with innocence, minors or animals or creatures that cannot consent, people that cannot consent, then it's generally in the purview of what somebody wants to be doing, then it's okay. But to back up what I just said a little bit also, I think if a person doesn't feel like what they're engaging in is secretive, they can't tell anybody about it, and that then creates enormous amount of shame, or it's abusive of the self or other, then it's probably in the spectrum of quote healthy.
Hmm. Therapists, let's talk about your website. I've seen so many private practice owners struggle with sites that just don't convert. Maybe you launched something quickly, used a DIY builder, or just haven't touched it in years. But here's the truth. Your website's the most powerful marketing tool you have. That's why I'm so excited to introduce you to Session Sites, our newest partner. They specialize in building high-converting websites just for therapists. So you can stop worrying about SEO, design, and tech and start attracting the right clients. Optimized for search engines so people find you, designed for engagement so visitors actually book a consult, built by experts who understand how therapists connect with clients. Most sites are live in just 3 weeks. I've talked to the owner and we've verified with several clients we've sent there that within 3 weeks you've got a website. If you're ready for a website that keeps your client book full, book a free tour today at sessionsites.com/Joe. That's session, SITES.com/Joe. Sessionsites.com/Joe to get your brand new website. When we think about just things for individuals, so whether it's the therapist listening as an individual or what they're working on with their clients, what are some of the things that are maybe categories or pillars that people should evaluate to maybe become more in touch with what they want?
Well, I think that's why I wrote What Turns You On. And I wrote that during the pandemic because I didn't have anything to do. And the subtitle to
I
that
wrote
book,
a book during that too about the
right, I'm
4-day work
sure.
week, so
Okay.
worked out great.
I'm sure many people got busy during that time, but the subtitle to that book is A Guide to Living Your Best Sex Life. And the thinking behind it was, how do I break down all of the forces that bear down on us? Like for you, you're talking about growing up in a sex positive household and going outside into a Catholic school every day. And how did those two conflicting messages support or distort your sexuality? So I ask people to deconstruct all the things and all the messages they got from school, religion, friends, family, media, pornography, you name it, so they can start to look at how they even constructed their ideas about sex and sexuality. And then really talking about, an exploration of um, writing and thinking about what are the things that are exciting to me? What would make me feel good? What things do I want to try? And then how can I do that safely? And what does consent mean? And how does this align with my personal value systems? So it's really like a 360-degree examination of what I like, what I don't like, what I want, what's influenced me, because I believe that our sexuality is at the core of our personhood. And when that is tampered with in any way, when we're children, it really sets the stage for a very shame-based sense of one's self, one's body, one's very being. And so when there has been trauma like that, that has to be repaired before you can ask the luxurious question of what turns me on? What do I like?
Yeah. What else do you cover in the book that would be helpful for clinicians?
Well, the book is broken down into mind, body, and heart, and it does have somatic tracking guides in it for the user. So, after a section, let's say on body image, there'll be a little box that says, how are you doing? What do you need right now? Are you okay? Do you need a cup of tea? Do you need a hug? Do you need to stop here? And then we also ask people to write a story, memory, or poem about the section they just worked on to see what comes up, unconsciously or preconsciously. And those are really fascinating things that people write about. They tell us a lot about what's going on for them. Um, so there's that aspect to it. The workbook was meant to have an affective sort of right brain approach to it, even though it is a left brain proposition because you're writing. And to be able to shuttle back and forth between those two things to make sure that the reader is taking care of themselves, and also trying to educate them on tracking their own interoceptive cues as they go along. And then there's some pretty bawdy things in there about, oral sex. The illustrations are really quite fun and animated penises and vaginas, and so it has a cute aspect to it. Also, it's quite non-threatening in that way. And then also, as I said, a big section on consent. what are the ABCs of consent? What does consent mean? People tend to think that consent is a one and done matter, and it isn't. Consent can change in the middle of a sex act. So, really educating people about being aware what their behaviors are, what they're saying, how they communicate, how to have conversations with a lover about what you like, don't like, etc. And then it ends in a place of creating a sexual health plan. Like, what is my sexual health plan? What are the components of it? So that at least at the end of the workbook, the person has a sense of themselves and they know, like, hey, this is what I like or what I want to try. So I can confidently sit down with a partner and talk about this, and maybe not all the details that were uncovered in the workbook, but at least, this is the trailhead. This is where I want to start, as opposed to, I think what many people do is they get involved sexually and they have no idea what they want or like or don't like until they're having sex, and then something happens and it hurts or they don't like it or it feels weird. And then, especially for women, they're sort of frozen in those moments and they don't know what to say. So sadly, often they say nothing.
Mm. When there's that rebuilding with partners, with those like frozen moments you were just talking about, how does that happen in a healthy way? Like, what can the partner do? What inner work can the person that felt frozen do? Like what does that look like?
Well, it depends on the relationship. Um, is this somebody you just hooked up with on Hinge or Bumble, and you just had sex with them for the first time? Or is this in a long term committed relationship or everything in between? So, generally, and you know, I had a story like this in my practice where somebody hooked up with somebody, and they talked about liking rough sex. And it turned out the female's version of rough sex and the male's version of rough sex were very different. And he thought everything was fine. And the next day he found out she was not fine at all. She'd
Mm,
actually made a police report. So that is a real disconnect and a lack of explicit conversation, because she's saying, yeah, I like rough sex, but I don't know that she really knew what that meant. And this was a male who was not even remotely interested in having sex with a female against her will. That was
mm,
not his jam at all. And so you can hear, without explicit details, the horrible disconnect in this configuration. And after they had sex, they hung out in bed, they chatted, they had a little snack. He had no idea anything was wrong until the following day.
mm. Yeah, so it just sounds like those conversations and going beyond just initial conversations to have that ongoing discussion.
Right. And if you are in a long term committed relationship and you heard this podcast or you read something, let's just talk about when 50 Shades of Grey came on the scene and everybody was trying at least BDSM light. So you see a read or hear something and you go to your partner and you say, hey, I want to try this tonight. Um, do you have the courage to sit down eyeball to eyeball and tell that person why or what about it you like or what you think would turn you on about it? And that goes back to Snarch's statement about sex being a developmental task. Because one of the things he talked about was eye open sex. Can you look at your partner while you're receiving pleasure, and can you tolerate your partner seeing you as a sexual being? So watching you watch them while you're having pleasure. And that, he would say, was a differentiated stance that you could really hold on to yourself. And obviously there can't be any shame present for that kind of connection, which is a deep, deep, intimate, erotic connection.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
what level of conversation can you have? Because if you cannot talk to your partner about sex, it's going to be very difficult to have explorative, fun, interesting kind of sex.
What do you wish that therapists knew? I like there was just like baseline knowledge for any new graduate when it comes to how they work with their clients.
Well, there are studies and dissertations written on the topic of therapist comfort with sex and sexuality, that if the therapist doesn't bring it up, the clients don't bring it up. And if a therapist is not comfortable with their own masturbation or being able to say masturbation, or their own sex life is in shambles and they don't want to talk about it, then that gets transmitted both verbally and non-verbally in the therapeutic setting. And it becomes an implicit barrier to those conversations. We're just not having them. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times in my career I've had clients come in who were in marital therapy for 5, 8 years, and now they were ready for sex therapy. That's why they were coming to see me. And I would think, how in Goddess's name did you spend 8 years with a therapist and never talk about your sex life as a couple? What were you talking about?
Right.
So that is, I guess, my soapbox is that I really, really hope for therapists coming out of graduate school or newly licensed to explore human sexuality, take some courses, educate yourself on just the basics about it, so that you can start to understand how important sex is in a relationship. It's really the emotional glue that keeps us together. It's the connection that we have that makes, leaving your socks in the middle of the floor or tripping over my shoes just not that big of a deal. But when people aren't having sex for long periods of time and there's resentment, you get all sorts of arguing and misappropriations and affairs, or people turning to pornography, which can feel like an affair for some people because they feel neglected. A lot goes out the window. So, sex is a very simple thing. It doesn't have to be extreme or elaborate, but that regular connection, I think, keeps couples' hearts open and has them able to weather, the storms and vicissitudes of life a lot easier.
Mm. What what questions do you wish were part of every intake, whether it's couples work or individual?
Well, tell me about your sex life, or how is your sex life? Or tell me about your sexual history would probably be a better question as I'm thinking about it, because if somebody has a sexual history of incest or covert incest or rape, then how's your sex life is probably not a very sensitive question. But taking a sexual history would be an additive thing to any intake process. When was the first time, you learned about sex? How old were you? Or the first image you saw on TV, or the first time you saw a body part that wasn't your own that you remember. And then people will generally start to open up and they will tell you if they were, sexually tampered with in some ways, or even if there was date rape in college, they'll tell you. But if you don't ask, um, then they won't tell you. And it's interesting because everybody takes trauma histories now, but they don't take sexual histories. And that would be the main thing I would recommend that people do.
Mm. So awesome. The last question I always ask is, if every private practitioner in the world were listening right now, what would you want them to know?
That, what would I want them to know? Mostly that we sit in a vaunted position, and that is not meant to be better than or one up, but we sit in a position of power. And it's really important that we educate ourselves regularly on all the topics at hand, but that we are as open and non judgmental and educated as we possibly can be, so that we can hold a space for people to tell us their deepest, darkest secrets and pains. And I think we do that by resourcing ourselves, because a supervisor said to me once, you can't outgive, but you can burn out from not receiving. So we
Mm.
burn out not from giving too much, but we burn out from not receiving. So our own self care, our own education, our own sexuality, that it's almost our job to be healthy, balanced human beings if we're going to go forward and help people do the same.
So awesome. Alex, if people want to get your books or find out more about your work, where should we send them?
Well, all of my books can be found on Amazon.com. You can also find them on our website, centerforhealthysex.com. And you can find me, Alex, at centerforhealthysex.com.
So awesome. Thank you so much for being on the Practice of the Practice podcast.
Thank you, Joe.
Well, this series is so interesting. All of these things that we've been covering this month around a better mental wellness. Small steps in the right direction, I would say, is more my approach than making these huge changes. That's how we kicked off this year. It was saying, okay, let's not do these big New Year's resolutions that we just, quote, fail on within a month. But let's just say, what's one mindset or one step in the right direction that can help me just be a little bit more in my body, a little bit more in my mind, a little bit more in my practice, and that we can move in that direction together and find this knowledge together. We have experts every single month. We have several experts in our membership communities that come in and do Ask the Experts for an hour, where you can just ask people questions. Many of these people I've been interviewing recently are going to be one of those experts in 2025. If you have not looked at joining one of our memberships, you're going to want to head over to practiceofthepractice.com/membership. That's where we have a list of all the memberships that we have, and that you can figure out which track is right for you. We have ones for people just starting their practice. We have tracks for people that already have a solo practice, but they don't really want to grow past that. We have Group Practice Launch for people that are starting a group practice, and Group Practice Boss for group practice owners. So if that sounds good to you, head on over to practiceofthepractice.com/memberships. We could not do this show without our partners, and Session Sites is our newest partner. They help you optimize your website. They help make your website designed for engagement, and even better, your site's going to be live in 3 weeks. So whether you haven't touched it in years or you're starting from scratch, they have an awesome deal going on. Just head on over to sessionsites.com/Joe. Again, that's sessionsites.com/Joe to get that website that you absolutely deserve. Thank you so much for letting me into your ears and into your brain. Have a great day. I'll talk to you soon. Special thanks to the band Silence is Sexy for that intro music, and this podcast is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regard to the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, the producers, the publishers, or guests are rendering legal, accounting, clinical, or other professional information. If you want a professional, you should find one.